On today's show, Mike Budenholzer and the Milwaukee Bucks part ways, bringing an end to a 5-year stint with the franchise. Not totally unexpected news, but still major news, and what could be the start of a very interesting offseason for the Bucks. So we're going to break down what it means immediately, perhaps a quick short list, and also just our reflections of how we felt when this news dropped. Let's get into
it. You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Bucks. My name's Kane Pittman. You can see and hear me on the show Monday to Friday, and also find my work over at ESPN. Alongside me, for the first time in 7 days, it has been a tough week not hanging out with Frank, the founder of brewhoop.com and longtime voice of the podcast, Frank Madden. As always, we thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first watch or first listen of every single weekday. And we said that there was going to be plenty happening this offseason. It took 1 week for our first major news podcast of the offseason. I feel like it won't be the last one, but we appreciate the support. Go back and check out some of the other pods through the week. We've had some good conversations as well. Howard Beck was on the show yesterday, which was fascinating to get a national perspective. So check that out. Subscribe, drop a like, a comment, and all those things because we appreciate the support even through the offseason. It's free to do. And it really helps us. So Mike Budenholzer, I woke up to the news. Frank said, he sent me a message and said, yep, that's pod tonight. And I was like, that's great. What are we going to talk about? Salary cap, roster moves. And then I checked Twitter and I quickly realized why there might be a need to do a podcast tonight. So Mike Budenholzer gone. I saw the Woj tweet. Anyway, there's plenty to get through. 5 straight seasons in the playoffs. Second championship coach in history, 69% regular season winning record. Let me just start, Frank, by asking, how did you actually feel when you saw the announcement? Because, again, this wasn't unexpected, and we both spoke after the game and said, look, this is probably going to happen. But I'm curious how you felt.
Yeah, I mean, I I think just, sadness to some extent, right? And I think for 2 obvious reasons. One, we wouldn't be talking about Bud being fired in early May if not for the fact that the Bucks just had a catastrophic performance in the playoffs. So, Bud being kind of the first domino, the first fall guy, however you want to frame it, is a unfortunate reminder of the Bucks' failure to live up anywhere close to the expectations that we had for them going to the playoffs. And as we said right after that game, it's like, I don't know how you just kind of run it back with the same team, the same coaching staff, and kind of risk that. Oops. Sure, I'll take your hat.
Well, we've got a guest, and when there is a big coaching move for the Milwaukee Bucks,
you want to say hi to my friend Kane?
We bring in the big guns, and here's Tilly.
Yeah. Here's Tilly. She can't hear you because I'm on my headphones.
Oh, I will say
That's
she
Kane,
looks nicer. She looks nicer than you, Frank. She's not as grumpy.
She's supposed to be in bed, so okay. You gotta go to bed. Okay. All right. Night.
Carry on.
A lot of sleepless nights with Tilly's really thinking hard about this coaching move.
No doubt.
Hard to fall asleep. No. Yeah. I mean, I think sadness because it just it's kind of the chickens coming home to roost, or however you want to frame it, of what we just saw happen in the first round of the playoffs. And again, I can't imagine ownership, front office, anybody was thinking that this is what we'd be talking about in early May. But then I think also just in the grand scheme of, as you kind of laid it out, sadness because this is arguably the best coach the team's ever had, put Don Nelson and Larry Costello probably in that conversation as well. But, thinking back 5 years ago, like I said, would have been Eric Name and I talking about, this hire when Bud first arrived. And I mean, if you had told us the Bucks were going to win more games than any other team in the league and they'd, have the best record 3 times, they'd win an NBA championship, I mean, we would have been just grinning ear to ear, right? I mean, this was, I hesitate to say this was everything we could have asked for, because of course, yeah, I mean, like, could you have potentially could you have won another championship? Of course there were opportunities to do that, right? I mean, year in and year out, I think, it's fitting that Bud being a Spurs guy, I think the Spurs culture, right, that's always been an ambition for this franchise to have that sort of, year in and year out consistency. Just give yourself a chance to win a championship every year, right? You know that you can't count on it any given year that you're actually going to win it because it's really hard. But if you just give yourself a chance in and year out, at some point you are going to break through, and thankfully the Bucks did. And as much as a lot of people obviously tried to diminish Bud's accomplishments or kind of look for the flaws in him as a coach, the culture change that he brought, going from Jason Kidd, and of course the team talked about, things like trying to be consistent like the Spurs and all that. But I mean, that was not the Bucks until Bud got here, and the stability, the lack of drama, the consistency night in, night out, and obviously ultimately winning a championship. I mean, that's what you strive for, right? That's what you hope for. And for him to have gotten the Bucks, played his role in getting the Bucks to the top of the mountain, I think will forever be, I'll certainly forever be thankful for what he did for this franchise. And, again, then just thinking about the context of his departure, right? I mean, to hear the news that literally his finds out that his brother has passed away suddenly right before, I think, Game 4, and then to have these two catastrophic performances. I keep saying catastrophic, but those are the type of terms I think you have to describe kind of what we saw. And so to be dealing with the off-court real tragedy, and then to see this team collapse in ways that literally, like, it's hard to find examples of a team this good playing so poorly to close out a first round playoff loss. It just sucks on every possible level. And again, I think with time, I think people will appreciate what Bud did and all the good things that he brought in. That banner is going to fly forever. So yeah, I think sadness that it had to end like this. I think appreciation that again, I'm a glass half full person, even though I sometimes feel like I'm a pessimist. But when I think back on this era, I will always think of it as the era that saw the Bucks win a championship that I kind of was skeptical was ever going to come. So yeah, I think it's just I don't know, if somebody's like thrilled about Bud being fired. I get people. I mean, we even said it, right? I mean, our view was like, hey, we think this probably has to happen, right? Like somebody's got to give here. It feels like it's time, and we can get into a bit more of maybe some of those like silver linings or the potential upsides of this move. But overall, I think just yeah, I mean, for the person and for everything that kind of came over the past few years, I think just a time to again feel bad that it had to end like this, but also appreciate all the good things that we also saw over the last few years.
I agree with most of the things you said. I will say, by the way, your internet's a little sketchy. I don't know if you've got any other options, but it's still very workable. But I'm just throwing it out there if there's anything you can do on the fly. But I tell you what I thought about, because, for me with sports, you remember different images or different moments. And yeah, there were some tough moments. And the interesting thing about this era with the Bucks is they won the title smack bang in the middle of probably the disappointments on either side, and so many things. The pandemic is maybe one of the biggest question marks we will have about this iteration of the Bucks, and what would have happened if COVID didn't hit and they were just absolutely on a tear at that point in time. So who knows? There's all these types of what ifs, and hey, that's kind of what Giannis said. When it's sports and things happen in sports, and we are just thankful that they did get that title. But yeah, I thought about an emotional Budenholzer hugging an emotional Giannis straight after the title, and yeah, just some really awesome memories. Then Bud going crazy on the buses in the parade, and so there's so many good memories. And I will say that I was really glad today that I tweeted something about hopefully he's remembered as a legend of the franchise, because I think it has been nasty, some of the fire Bud stuff. I've clearly always been a guy that I think he's been treated harshly. I don't think that coaching is easy to assess as a fan, and I think that he has been a scapegoat for a lot of the problems, and I haven't really liked that. So I think he's a far better coach than what he gets credit for. I think there are many, many things that whatever the Bucks do moving forward, we won't be able to understand what the franchise is going to miss by not having Bud around there. So I think they're going to lose a lot. I think it's definitely a risk, but I also appreciate that a lot of the fans said, I love Bud. He's always going to be a legend, but I think it was time. I don't necessarily disagree with that. I think that's a fair way of looking at this. But what about the player personnel? Maybe that's what we can talk about next. And then I want to ask you about a short list of potential names. And I think over the next week or so, we'll get more in depth and try and get some people that are closer to the potential candidates to really break down the pros and cons. So we'll get to those questions because there's still heaps to talk about. I'll get to eBay Motors first. For a championship team like the 2021 Milwaukee Bucks, it's all about making sure every player is a perfect fit. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors with eBay Guaranteed Fit. You can be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage and look for the green check to know the part will fit or you'll get your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. The player personnel thing is interesting because I've at least, and it's not in a full-blown defense of Mike Budenholzer, but I think part of the credit you have to give to Bud is the fact that I don't think that our fans, Bucks fans, it is not Locked On Button. That's not how I describe them, the listeners. But the Bucks fans, I don't think Bucks fans can look at Bud and they can point to, well, maybe not the quickest in-game adjustment guy. Maybe there's some stuff down the stretch where it wasn't his strong suit, in-game management. But I don't think you can deny that he maximized the talents of what is a flawed roster. And so if you're bringing in another coach, it's going to be fascinating to see what this team does. And perhaps no player more so than the unrestricted free agent, the big man who has been a dominant force for this team, Brook Lopez. I just think it could potentially change the direction this team tries to go if someone comes in with a different vision. But we've had the comfy blanket on for the last 5 years, knowing at least the way the team was going to play. Things are going to change. They kind of have to.
So I would agree. I mean, of the, there's only two players that really matter a lot from an offseason perspective. And that's Chris and Brook, obviously. Chris, as much as, I think there's obviously some questions about him and his defense and, how flexible he's going to be in the future, especially as he ages. I think obviously I totally get it, right? Like with Brook, the fact that his skill set is so suited to, a zone drop defense. And, again, that's not the only way to play basketball. I get why, I've seen kind of people pondering like, oh, what does this mean for Brook? Given that Bud was so aligned to playing that style. But to me, it's like, let's just think about this. Okay. If I'm John Horst, ownership, whatever, I'm interviewing coaches, and I know that, I cannot replace Brook Lopez with, Bam Adebayo or, homeless man's Bam Adebayo, whatever you guys think, whatever you might think a different type of, center might look like.
Who's homeless man's Brook Lopez? It's not
Robin Lopez.
You said it. I did not say that. I would never say that about Robin.
I mean, hey, budget. Yeah, budget Brook Lopez, right? Hey, minimum Brook Lopez, good replacement. But like, let's just think about this. Okay, so I would say maybe this is the first question I ask of a coach in an interview. So Brook Lopez is a free agent. Let's say he's going to cost $15 to $18 million starting salary. Doesn't preclude you from, bringing back Chris Middleton or something like that, but could preclude you given kind of the second apron and some of the fact that I think the second apron, maybe not this year, but quite possibly this, even as soon as the summer, is going to effectively act as a hard-ish cap for most of the kind of big spending teams. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means. But basically, it means like you can pay Brook and Chris, and then probably everybody else is, the Joe Ingles, Jay Crowder, if people actually, are thinking about him. You're not bringing those guys back for, 6-7 million or something like that. Like you're basically offering them like minimums or something close to that and filling out the roster that way. So let's assume that. So would you like to bring back Brook Lopez, or do you want to use maybe your taxpayer mid-level, $7 million or whatever to sign some free agent to be determined, right? what would you rather do? Would you rather bring back Brook Lopez, who just finished second in Defensive Player of the Year, is going to make all defensive first team, is one of the most lovable humans on earth. Giannis loves him. Still a terrific offensive player when utilized. Do you want to bring back that guy, or can you just not figure out how to use that guy? You can't figure out a way to make the most of that guy. Again, and you don't have to play him 35 minutes, right? You can play him 25, 27 minutes or whatever, right? Rest of the game, switch everything, do whatever weird stuff.
45 if you're Nick Nurse.
Yeah. If a coach comes in and tells him, well, Brook Lopez, he doesn't fit my system. I'm gonna run a different system, and like, oh, I can't use a like incredible rim protecting big who's able to step out on the floor and has super touch offensively and is like a gem of a human being. Like, get the fuck out of here. Like, to me, like, I get it. Not everybody's gonna want to play like maybe as pronounced of a zone drop as Brook did for Bud, but like, Brook can also play a little higher on the floor, right? You're never going to run an all switching scheme with Brook Lopez or something like that. But, Nick Nurse, you know how many playoff series Nick Nurse has won without Marc Gasol? 0.
Right.
0.
But this is what I'm saying, though.
Every playoff series that Nick Nurse won, he had playing Marc Gasol, who's, a big lumbering. At that point, he was pretty much also in a similar kind of stage of his career as Brook, was obviously not a switch guy or whatever, right? And of course, the Raptors ultimately didn't go anywhere when they played all their wings and they had to go get Jakob Poeltl to basically do kind of what Brook does now. So to me, I think Brook, yes, I think it's an interesting question. Might Brook be more interested in playing someplace else depending on who the coach is? It's possible, but to me, if a coach says he doesn't want Brook Lopez, then I don't want that coach. This is kind of where I come out on it. Because again, it's not like you're talking about maxing Brook Lopez. So that is my full-throated defense of Brook Lopez as a continuing piece of this team. And I realize he's 35 years old, but if someone has a better plan for how to make this team, able to contend for a title, I'm very open to it. But I still think Brook Lopez has to be part of that equation. And again, I know I'm preaching to the choir a little bit, Kane, but you asked the question. Do you view it differently?
No, I don't. So, but the way I'm looking at it is, and I guess I'm framing it through again, and I'm going to come off, and people go, "You are an idiot, Kane. All you're doing is sucking up to Bud this whole podcast." But the point I would make, and the point that I've made in the past, is that I don't think anyone can sit here and say that Bud didn't maximize Brook Lopez. So you're right. It might not be to that extent. You probably need to figure out something with other bigs that you can play. And is Bobby Portis that guy? I don't know. Maybe that's a bigger question that you need to ask, right? So my point would be is I don't think any coach is going to come in and not want Brook Lopez. So I still fully assume that if Brook wants to be in Milwaukee, he'll be in Milwaukee. But I can't see that a new coach is going to come in and just, you can't play a drastically different stuff. Like that would make absolutely zero sense. So I guess the point I'm making in again is, when you bring in another coach, you'll be looking for different things, and things will obviously change and there'll be differences. But when it comes to some of your key pieces, I don't think a lot's going to change, particularly with the guy in the middle.
Yeah. I mean, Brook is so good at what he does, but he does it a certain way. And I agree, if Brook Lopez is on your team, then you're going to play half the game in a style that fits him, which is going to be traditional drop defense, right? And again, if people think that's like some 4-letter word, I don't know what to tell you. I mean, the Bucks obviously at various points during their title run went away from Brook. I mean, the Phoenix series, they were closing games without Brook generally. And I think, again, like, let's give Bud some credit. Like, he read the room. He used the guys that made sense to close those games. And that was typically going small with Giannis at center. And so I think that's just, to me, that is likely going to be part of the story moving forward is, maybe you continue to play drop with Brook, but maybe Brook plays a little higher on the floor. Maybe he's not, standing at the 3-point or at the, the charge circle against guys in the same way that he does, that we saw this year. But that's fine. I mean, again, like, I think it's unfair to say that Brook can only play like just that super deep drop. I think he can do other things. Yeah. He's smart. He's very cerebral. So I think, again, he may play different. And I think the question to me is more of like, what do you do in the other, 20 to 25 minutes of the game when Brook isn't on the floor? And that's where I think, somebody like Nick Nurse could say, all right, well, I'm going to have Giannis at center and maybe Bobby Portis is around, maybe he's not. But I'm going to play much more aggressively. I'm going to try to force turnovers. Giannis is, if Brook forces you to play one way that, has proven to be very effective typically, Giannis lets you play a lot of different ways, right? And we saw that when he was out. Without Giannis, your ability to do versatile things defensively really drops. So I think, to me, that's probably the better question is like, what are you doing the rest of the game? And, are you leaning a lot more into Giannis at center with 4 non-bigs, right? Like, or are you still going to play like a Bobby Portis, or some other kind of like big-ish guy with Giannis? I mean, those are, I think, some of the interesting questions that, the next coach is going to have to answer.
Absolutely. And also, don't get me wrong, like, I am excited about the prospect of seeing different ways this team can utilize different guys, particularly offensively, I think, as well. So, yeah, there's definitely a level of excitement. It might be a little bit hard to tell now because you don't know exactly what the roster is going to look like. But why don't we get to the point? Everyone wants to hear names and of possibilities of head coaches, and people, all the listeners will have their own guys. So make sure you jump into YouTube comments. I already know you will, but let us know who is your prime candidate. A lot of Nick Nurse, but let's get to some of the other candidates coming up next. All right, I said off the top, thanks for making Locked On Bucks your first watch or first listen of every weekday. We said it's going to be a busy offseason. It started early, but from next week, we're going to be able to go through the different candidates in a little bit more detail as well. So plenty of cool content coming up on Locked On Bucks. So make sure you continue to join us, subscribe, drop a like and comment, and do all those things. We appreciate it, specifically the everydayers who are still with us through the offseason every day. I know who you are because you jump into YouTube comments. Some of you abuse me every single day, which I love. We get into it. It's good fun. All right, let's go through the candidates. Let me just rip off a few names that are in my head. I don't have a list in front of me, and then you jump in and add in whatever or give your thoughts. So Nick Nurse, clearly, already discussed him. Frank Vogel, another championship coach. Hey, why not? Kenny Atkinson is a guy that I'm seeing his name floated a lot as well. Obviously, Charles Lee, who Bucks fans know very well, been on the bench for an extended period of time there. Becky Hammond, I think the Raptors may have asked a question about doing an interview with her there as well. Went to the WNBA. She just seems to win whatever she does. Who else have we got down the list? I did have a few others in my head there as well. But I think those are the main names I'm seeing. Who have I left out here, Frank?
So I was kind of brainstorming, was chatting with some folks and kind of saying like who would be on, your like top 5 interview list. And it was basically the first 4 names you gave. So Nurse, Atkinson, Charles Lee, Vogel, and then the other name that I had, which like, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that this is like, like, oh, this guy like would be a great hire. He might not. But a guy that I've found interesting and had kind of a mixed bag during his 2 years in the league as a head coach prior to this, but Steve Nash. I'm curious what Steve Nash, and what kind of growth he may have left as a head coach. Again, kind of hard to figure out what to make of his tenure in Brooklyn, because they were sort of like the anti-Bucks in terms of, just all drama all the time. I don't know that, Steve probably seems happy to live in Brooklyn and watch soccer and, maybe not be a head coach right now. So I don't know if he'd want to move to Milwaukee and be a head coach for the Bucks, but if he's looking for a, more stable, roster and less drama where you can just sort of focus on basketball, the Bucks obviously could be appealing. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, and there's other, I think I would say this. I mean, we talked about it back 5 years ago when Eric and I were talking about this decision when they hired Bud. With Giannis, even then, right? I mean, Giannis was whatever he was, right? 23 years old or whatever. Even then, it felt like, man, they got to really nail this coaching pick. You don't want to squander this time that you have with Giannis. We already knew then that he was going to be an MVP candidate type player, and obviously they didn't squander that with Bud. But I think the same thing applies even more now. Like I think going with a young coach who has not been a head coach in the league feels like a risk. And I think Charles Lee is probably the only one of that I could kind of wrap my mind around being like, yeah, I can get comfortable with that. I think there's obviously natural questions about like, okay, well, what is Charles Lee going to do that solves what you didn't like about Bud, right? I mean, we don't know, right? We don't know if Charles Lee was saying we got to put Giannis on Jimmy Butler, or like we got to
Yeah.
double Jimmy Butler, and like Bud was overruling him or something like that, right? I mean, he may have had worse ideas than Bud for all we know, when it comes to like some of these like key moments that Bucks fans have obviously criticized Bud over. I mean, did Charles Lee try to call a timeout when when the game was tied with 4.5 seconds left? Like, I don't know. So I think on the one hand, I think the appeal with him is that you do have, I think, a solid culture, and kind of like, when Nick Nurse was hired to replace Dwayne Casey, is it just we don't need a hard reset. We need maybe a soft reset. Blow in the cartridge, put it back in, and let's rock and roll for all you fans of, old Super
Mega Drive?
Nintendo, Super Nintendo video games. I think I blew in cartridges on N64 too. I don't know if that actually ever helped, but anyway.
Of course it did.
But yeah, I mean, I could at least see the argument for Charles Lee again, if from sort of like that, you keep continuity, but also you get a fresh perspective. But other than that, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's hard enough speculating on how established coaches would fit in Milwaukee. I think that's really hard too. I don't know that there's a slam dunk here. I think Nurse is probably has the most, sex appeal in not a literal sense, but a figurative sense, given he's won a championship and he's kind of like the anti-Bud in some ways. I think people are probably, taking that as being like all positive and not, thinking about some of the friction he had with players and apparently assistant coaches in Toronto. Although it's a little bit weird. I was trying to read up on Nick Nurse and like some of the problems, and I kept reading like, oh, like frustration over not playing young players. And I'm like, who have the Raptors had who were like young players that like should have played? And I was like, well, Scotty Barnes played obviously an absolute ton the last 2 years. And I was reading an article by I think Michael Granger from the Toronto Star. And it was like he was like referencing how like in November, like Delano Banton and Jeff Downton Jr. Jeff Downton, who had like that random cup of coffee with the Bucks briefly. It's like, oh, they had these good games and we didn't see him again. I'm just like people are really pissed off because Delano Banton didn't play.
To be fair, Frank, to think about, I'm not going to name any names, but think about some of the players that Bucks fans have been furious about that have gone on to have
Jordan
Sterling
Nwora.
0 minute, like that's
exactly.
It's a thing. It's a thing.
Yeah, it's people just get pissed off about random dudes who are just dudes not playing. But anyway, so that was a little bit kind of funny. I was like, I don't know if I find that problematic, but it is he is the anti-Bud in terms of playing time. He's a run everybody into the ground guy instead of a nurse them through the regular season guy. So yeah, let me just say this: like, if the Bucks hire Nick Nurse, there's a very good chance they are, again, I would say they're expected to be good during the regular season, but if they go 51-31 and they're like the third or fourth seed, I'm sure there's going to be a ton of people that are pissed off about, the fact that the Bucks suddenly give up crap tons of corner threes again, because the Raptors always did give up the most corner threes and they gambled too much on defense and their offense stunk and, they couldn't score in the half court. Oh, where have we heard that before? Right. So again, like, I don't think there's like, and again, what do we know, right? From the outside, it's so hard to judge coaches. Yeah. It's so hard to judge coaches who are like actually coaching your team, let alone prognosticate on who's going to work with your team. But yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the group. And again, am I veering overly conservative towards guys that are a bit more of known quantities? Yes. But again, I think that's just because a reflection of you don't really have time to screw around and experiment, right? You got to make the next 2 years, the next year, right? Next year, 2 years count, because that could be it as far as the like window of like high level contention with this team, barring some type of roster moves that kind of reset some of the core pieces who at this point are very old, and there's not an easy way to again sort of turn the page to a younger version of the roster around Giannis. And again, not that anybody wants to hear that, but I think that's been my assumption for a while, and certainly right now, there's that's the default path.
Yeah, there's been so much, again, I keep saying it, but there's been so much stability over the last 5 years. The last thing you want, and I guess this is why maybe you lean into a coach you know a little bit more about, the last thing you want is to get halfway through next regular season, people are unhappy. You're winning games probably because you're going to have enough talent to win games, but there is an unsettled nature to the locker room that hasn't been there before. I mean, ultimately, you just want to have a coach that can do some different things. Yes, ideally, I know what the fans are saying. In-game management, maybe is sort of a step up there. Again, I find that hard to read from the outside, but those things, and then you get to the postseason and give yourselves another shot. I will say a couple of the other names, and Nick Nurse. We know the Bucks had interest in Fred Van Vliet at the trade deadline. Fred Van sore feet because he played 46 minutes per game under Nick Nurse. So anyway, maybe the Bucks still have interest there. Two other quick names before we wrap this up. People keep mentioning Ty Lue. By the way, what he's been able to do with the Clippers, despite the fact they've never been healthy and they're always competitive, even in the postseason. And I know they got eliminated in 5 games, but they were good. Like they played really good basketball. So Ty Lue, I'd be fascinated in. I just don't know.
I think he'd be probably my top pick if he was available. But as of now, like, why would he become available? Like, I guess it's possible, but yeah, maybe in like kind of the same way that Bud became available from Atlanta, right? Where it's kind of like, they're not
Ty's
really
like, give me
him,
Giannis,
but like,
like,
yeah. So.
And the other one is just talk about a retread. The old Pringle man, Mike D'Antoni, and he would have an interesting offense. I don't know if he still wants to coach, Frank.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's the package D'Antoni Nash package or something. If you hire one, you get them, because that was obviously the pairing that Nash had in his first year in Brooklyn. But before we go, I one thing I did want to hit on. I think probably the thing I don't know if I'd say I'm most optimistic about, but the thing that I've been thinking a lot about today, and I know we were chatting about it a little bit, is when we talked about the move from Jason Kidd to Mike Budenholzer, somewhat famously, Giannis was like, oh, Giannis is like not happy that they're moving on from Jason Kidd. Like, who knows how sad he really was about that. But I think we all agreed, like, look, Jason Kidd, however much credit you want to give him, there was another level that Giannis could unlock, and he probably needed a different voice, a new staff to help him do that. Mission accomplished, right? Mike Budenholzer, his staff, come in, he immediately wins 2 MVPs, third year wins the finals MVP, defensive player of the year. I mean, they were able to do that. I think, and not so much indexing on the first round playoff series, because, at the end of the day, I mean, Giannis was not healthy during that series. And it's, a 2-game sample essentially of what we saw from him. And you look at his numbers, it's like, yes, he shot really poorly from the free throw line and
40 and 20.
Couldn't make a jump shot, right? But like, I mean, still what he was able to do.
Yes.
I mean, we're talking like just a ridiculous bar here for this guy. I do find it really interesting to think about, and I don't know if I would say I'm excited about it, but I think there's definite upside in a new staff coming in, or a new head coach coming in, maybe not a fully new staff, right? Especially if Charles Lee is the guy, but giving Giannis a different perspective, right? I think if Giannis desperately wanted Mike Budenholzer to stay on, I don't think we would have heard the news today that we did, right? I think this is a tacit acceptance by Giannis / potentially, I don't want to say he's like, oh, he was campaigning for Bud to get fired, but he didn't exactly, the comments after game 5 about not making adjustments, wanting to guard Jimmy, like not exactly the kind of stuff you say if you're concerned about your head coach getting fired, right? Like, so I think implicitly we can assume Giannis was fine with going in a different direction. Of course, he's going to have, I think, effectively veto rights over anybody that comes in. What is his opinion of Nick Nurse? Who knows, right? I'm fascinated, right? If Nick Nurse, like, I mean, I'm assuming he'll get interviewed, but if Nick Nurse like doesn't get interviewed, for instance, just throwing this out there, I think that says something about, maybe Giannis was talking to Pascal Siakam and, hearing some things, wherever it might be, right? So but I think there is definitely upside here that even if, whoever comes in, I mean, they can't magically snap their fingers and make Giannis hit free throws and make 3-pointers or something like that. But, I think especially this year, certain aspects of his game got stale. We talked about his regression from the foul line as a jump shooter, et cetera. Not that Giannis needs to like just get a different coach and change up his form or something like that again for like the 5th straight offseason or whatever it might be. But I think just psychologically, like there's upside here for Giannis to turn the page, different staff, different voices. Because again, like you kind of look at the way he plays and, he obviously got to a level of comfort with Bud that was mostly a very good thing. But, when you think about just like what are those little things that could put Giannis into an even higher stratosphere of productivity and capability, is there any coach that could get him to stop shooting freaking pull-up 3-pointers that are kind of record scratch shots? I don't know, maybe not. But it probably wasn't going to be Bud at this point, right? Like, is there somebody that can, again, get him to think a little bit differently? Maybe just, maybe again, just use him a little bit differently, put him in different positions, reconfigure the half-court offense in particular a little bit. And in doing so, unlock even another level to Giannis. Again, it's a long summer. That's maybe something we can dream of and hope for, because that's obviously, we talk about questions that you'd ask a head coach, prospective head coaches during this process. That would obviously be,
oh yeah,
1A or 1B or whatever it is, right? Like, how are you going to make the most of Giannis and obviously to a lesser extent Drew and Chris, but how do you take this supremely talented player that has done everything you could obviously hope for at this point, and how do you figure out how to make him even more dangerous, especially in the postseason when defenses are going to be focused on him even more? So fingers crossed that that Giannis and whoever the new coach / coaching staff is can engage in that type of productive partnership. And again, not that sometimes it's, again, it's not always that, like, it's not saying like, oh, Bud's just a bad coach, or like, oh, he couldn't figure out how to do anything more with Giannis. It's like, sometimes people just need different voices. Sometimes you just got to turn the page, and again, that just feels like where the Bucks landed, and obviously the first round series was the instigator of that. But as we've talked about, right, I mean, maybe that's ultimately what needed to happen. Maybe they needed a terrible flame out to act as a forcing mechanism rather than, to kind of not coast, but get through the first 2 rounds. And if you lose to the Celtics in the Eastern Conference Finals, then, are you afraid to make a drastic move because you feel like, oh, we're still like right there? I would love to still see the Bucks playing basketball. So I'm not saying it's a good thing that they are where they are, but who knows? Given what we saw from this team, it obviously did not feel like a team that was going to win a championship, even if they figured out how to get past the Heat. So onward and upward, and now we just need to figure out who the coach is that's going to take them there.
Look, we had these similar conversations that we had prior to today in the second round in 2021. Mm-hmm. And all I'll say is I am damn sure glad that they wrapped up that title before we had to have the podcast that we had today. So, yeah, a little bit of sadness. As I said, so many like fun memories that we'll go back and watch, and we'll watch those replays forever and see those celebrations, and Bud will always be a part of that. When it comes to the new coach, as you said, I'm glad you brought that up about the Giannis stuff. We definitely should have hit on that, because there's no question that any decision-making going on has to be centered around the thoughts and feelings of Giannis. And as you said, it doesn't mean he came out and demanded. That's not who he is. But I'm sure it wasn't done against his will. And the 2 questions you ask, how are you going to use Giannis? And number 2, who are you looking forward to seeing most at Summerfest? So I think they'll get the important stuff out of the way, and they'll come up with a fantastic candidate to be the head coach of the Milwaukee Bucks. So what it does do for Locked On Bucks is that next week we'll be able to go through some of these candidates in more depth and look at who the Bucks are going to potentially do. Certainly the reporting suggests the Bucks are going to take their time, so we might have a little period here before they lock in a head coach. But it's going to be fascinating, interesting podcast today. Let us know how you feel about it all. Go on.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting. You talk about the timing, right? I mean, Charles Lee has interviewed for a couple of jobs. I'm fascinated by how this news either slows down that decision or speeds it up, right? Because it seems like Charles Lee has a good chance of getting a head coaching offer in Detroit, or I believe Toronto now as well. So it's going to be an interesting dance there, right? Felt like things kind of slowed down with that right around the time that the Bucks went out, and I was kind of curious of, was Charles Lee hoping to see if this opportunity would come along? Kind of hard to say, but yeah, I mean, the Bucks obviously they have the most attractive job in the sense of anybody that wants to win a championship next year. But by the same token, guys can't wait around forever, and especially if you're a young head coach. I mean, there's appeal in going to a place like Detroit where there's not the same, pressure to immediately come in and win a championship, right? That is not easy. And, we talk about why GMs sometimes go to bad teams, things like that. Well, sometimes coaches want to go to young teams because, again, like the pressure is very real, and, it's rarefied air for the Bucks to be where they are. It's the second time now in 5 years the Bucks have the most attractive job opening in the NBA. So that obviously brings with it some privilege and an ability to dictate sort of the process. But by the same token, they can't take their time forever. So definitely going to be interesting to see how quickly this moves.
I am fascinated. I'm sure everyone else is as well. So as I said, let us know what you're thinking tonight as we enter the weekend. We'll be back on Monday for another week of Locked On Bucks.